Can the NBN be fixed?
And what tech was hottest at Computex 2021?
Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support. Hi there, welcome back to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News, the tech podcast where we catch up with Australia's leading technology journalists to sneak across the state lines and dive into the big tech stories of the week. I'm Adam Turner, down in Melbourne, and I'm joined as usual by Alex Kidman, a man who remembers when Internet Explorer was just a twinkle in Bill Gates' eye. Alex, now that the big IE is finally going to that big trash can in the sky, what other old tech can we send off to the farm?
Well, Adam, as you know, I'm a big enthusiast for retro tech generally, but that's usually kind of in gaming. The thing that utterly shocked me when I had to try and review it and then gave up reviewing it recently was a multifunction printer that still included fax. Fax
Ooh.
can fax off.
That is old school. I thought you were going to say printers in general, like inkjet printers. No.
We had this discussion before. The inkjet printer people were not happy, Adam. Remember that?
I'm sure they were. I think we lost the valuable inkjet demographic there. So we're doubling down. We're going the full Kidman this week. We've got not one Kidman, but two. Gus, Finder Editor-in-Chief, welcome back to the show. What tech do you think is ready for the scrap heap?
Well, I'm also going to go into the retro pile. I'm well and truly over the vinyl record revival. We didn't need that. We got rid of vinyl for a reason, so I've had it with these hipsters. It can go.
Shocked. Knowing how many vinyl records this man owns, I'm shocked. I'm genuinely flabbergasted at that. Wow.
I have not bought a new vinyl record in 20 years. I've got the ones that I originally bought, but I am not buying into this. Bring back the CD. Let it retain its dominance. That's what I say.
Oh, man, them fighting words. You come down to Melbourne and say that. See how far you'll get, man.
Well, I would, but I'm not allowed to. So.
No, for your own protection.
He'll come down with a bandolier filled with singles. You just watch him.
All right.
Make a single.
So it's time for a hot serve of our soup du jour. Yes, it's the NBN, the gift that keeps on giving. And surprise, surprise, there's something wrong. So we're going to dive into the latest issues with the NBN and its telco partners and look at the bigger questions about what can and should be done to try and sort this thing out. Like I said, closer to home down here in Victoria, we've made headlines recently passing legislation that makes electric vehicles a little bit less attractive, and so we'll dive into that. Not that anyone's driving very far in Melbourne this week, but first up, it's Computex 2021, and guess what? We couldn't go. Who knew? Alex would, normally be trawling the neon-drenched bars of Taipei to get the latest info, but of course, like everything else, we all had to stay at home. So, Alex, what were the surprises that we got from a virtual Computex?
So virtual Computex was weird because it was very much or a lot like regular Computex. And for people who are not au fait with it, Computex is what you might call the hard tech conference of the set. So CES is washing machines and TVs and consumer tech-centric. Mobile World Congress is, not surprisingly, mobile. E3 is games. Computex is where you go to talk silicon and processors and all the things that make all those other conferences actually work. So a lot of the news that we had this week were somewhat expected spec bumps and then just a few kind of cool bits and pieces of tech, as well as companies coming headfirst into a problem we've discussed a little bit on this show, but which they're saying, especially at a hard tech conference, is going to be a much bigger thing for several years to come, and that's chip shortages. That's not having enough chips to actually do all the cool tech that we want to do.
Did they also acknowledge the, cryptocurrency elephant in the room that it's very hard to get, say, a graphics card at the moment without paying through the nose because of what's happening with people using GPUs to run their crypto mining rigs?
So it's interesting. NVIDIA probably addressed this the most directly. Their big conference reveal was fairly widely leaked ahead of time. The GeForce 3080 Ti, a frighteningly expensive, about a $2,000 graphics card. It's not actually the top of the tree, but it sort of is.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting with that particular card is that there's hardware limiting on the exact computational stuff that you need for crypto. They're basically saying, hey, coin bros, go away. Don't buy this. Although Gus, I believe within that space, there's a bit less of a focus on the mining. The mining has become a bit less valuable over time, hasn't it?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that have happened on mining. On the one hand, we've seen new coins that have kind of gone for less of a proof of work, which requires lots of processing, and they're sort of moving to proof of stake and all these other confusing concepts. So you don't necessarily need the same grunt. We've also seen crackdowns, even within China, on saying, hey, we actually don't want people doing this. Like the notion that it was attractive to build a big Bitcoin farm and do that, even though Bitcoin's value is up so highly, there isn't the same demand. It doesn't mean there's not shortages, but I reckon, within the next year, you're going to see that, okay, that's not really the storyline that's going to play out in crypto. And that's good in as far as we still have that chip shortage. We still want to get these other pieces in there.
Yeah. We also saw, and this pretty much happens every Computex, AMD and Intel lining up their big processor reveals. So for Intel, they're going to have some 5 gigahertz laptop processors coming soon. And they also announced their new Alder Lake desktop processor systems. They're going to be 10 nanometer CPUs, not quite 7 nanometer yet, if you care about that stuff, although the details there were a bit thin on the ground. Whereas AMD had a lot of silicon to show off. So they've got desktop builder silicon with the Ryzen 5000Gs. They actually also had some really interesting mobile news. They're already a big player in things like consoles and things like that for graphics, but they're going to be working with Samsung on their next generation of Exynos processors. And where that gets interesting for Australians, before we dive too deep into the silicon, is Exynos is what you get in like a Samsung Galaxy S or a Galaxy Note phone, their high-end stuff, in Australia. And it's Samsung's own silicon, basically. Elsewhere in the world, especially in the States, you get Qualcomm-based stuff. And the Qualcomm stuff is usually a little bit faster, sometimes with worse battery life. But of late, the Exynos really has been tumbling down. Getting AMD on board for this could mean that actually when the next set of Galaxy phones rolls out, probably next year's, maybe not the mid-year notes, we might actually see that the Exynos ones are actually the better ones.
Okay, now, and as you say, that would be one for the books because it's usually people here get a bit dirty that they're not getting the Qualcomm processor.
Exactly so.
Yeah.
Qualcomm's usually more powerful, also slightly better image processing. And obviously, when you're talking a graphics central part of that processing, then it's it could upend that in some really interesting ways.
You're talking earlier about 10 nanometer and 7 nanometer processors. Now, for people who followed this game perhaps from home for a very long time, that's got to do with how small they can shrink things down on a chip, right? Like if you look at a chip up close, it looks like a street directory map with connections going in every direction. And if you get them closer and closer together, you get crosstalk between them, so it doesn't work. But they're getting better at shrinking them down. How shrinky can we get? If we're at 10 nanometers now and we're looking at 7 nanometers, there ain't many nanometers left before there's no gap at all.
Look, the engineering is fascinating and kind of deep. And I will say I don't personally know how close they can get it. You want smaller numbers, though, of course. So 7 is better than 10. You also end up, to my understanding, with a level of energy efficiency when you shrink them down.
Yeah.
But for the chip makers as well, the other big advantage, because the actual chip fabs make the chips in these huge effective wafers, if you can get them smaller, you get more per wafer. It's actually also more cost effective. So it's actually worth them pouring what are billions of dollars into the R&D for this. Even for, you might think, the difference between 10 and 7 nanometers isn't going to be that much, but it's 30%, mathematically speaking. And that potentially can mean a 30% better yield. It can lead to a whole bunch of other roll-on effects. I know there's also a lot of research being done in terms of alternate materials to actually build this stuff out of, where some of those size limitations might shrink away. I guess at a logical level, it stops at 1 or half a nanometer. I don't know, to be totally honest with you.
Yeah.
But they're putting a lot of work into this at the same time as they're addressing that whole chip shortage issue by building new fab plants. But that will take several years. And this was one of those kind of themes that came out of Computex. There was some cool tech on show, but everyone was kind of saying, there's going to be shortages. There's going to be shortages of just about everything. It's going to be much harder to build just about everything for the next couple of years. You even had Intel come out and say this. And even though it's been this kind of accepted secret thing for a while, actually having Intel say, look, things are going to be bad for a while, folks, that means something.
So, Gus, we've seen things like this in the past on a smaller scale. I think there was a flood in Thailand or Vietnam wiped out like the hard drive manufacturers for a while. So we've seen interruptions in the supply chain like this before, but have we seen anything on this scale before? Do you remember going back to the entire industry going, no, we're just going to have to put the brakes on for years?
No, we've never really had that problem before because we haven't had this constraint on the supply chain for such a long time. So I can't recall ever having seen that scale of things where they're saying it's going to be years of this. And we've known for a long time that there are delays. It just takes time. Even if you say, hey, we want to build 5 new chip fabs, you just can't do it overnight. Like, you need space, you need lots of water. And all those things are harder to do too. Like, it's harder to build a new chip fab now than it would have been 2 years ago, just because of the way the world's constrained. So I think, we are in uncharted territory here in terms of working out what the impact is, and we're going to keep seeing those surprise impacts. We've already seen versions of that this year with things like the HFC rollout for the NBN being affected by availability of specific bits of silicon. I think we're going to come to learn to appreciate just how many things have a processor in them that we haven't been thinking about very much, and that people just assumed they could get hold of them. It's not just the high-end stuff. I think the low-end stuff is what we're really going to notice the gaps in for a while.
And it's not just going to be a question of availability. It could also potentially be a question of cost, because as with any market, things get scarce, people put the prices up. That is already happening. There's so much reported around that. But speaking of things with rather high cost, the other interesting piece of news that came out of Computex involved our old friend Elon Musk, because AMD and Tesla confirmed that the AMD Ryzen processors and GPUs are actually going to be going into the new S and X series Teslas, giving them kind of on par with PlayStation 5 level performance. Adam, do you want a PlayStation 5 in your new shiny luxury EV?
I guess it depends on who or what is driving the car. If I can play, Gran Turismo while the car drives in a slightly less erratic fashion, yeah, sure. But there is potential for that to go badly if the game stops working and suddenly I'm actually driving.
Yeah, I think I'd leave that processing power for the car, and you'll just have to play Pong. That's how it's going to work out.
That might be better.
See, I think look, honestly, while Tesla does obviously have a play in self-driving cars and so on, the practical thing here is that they are more pushing the Tesla as a luxury brand, and that it should be able to. I mean, they've said for a while, we want this to be able to play The Witcher and Cuphead and all these other things, and that's passenger entertainment more than anything else. More so, I would hope, than your Tesla suddenly saying to you, "I'm sorry, Adam, I can't let you do that hook turn."
So, segueing beautifully from that to talk about electric vehicles in Victoria, Alex, we've decided to put some tax on electric vehicles, and not everybody's happy with that. The very short version of it is the government have said, well, when you buy petrol, you pay tax in part of that, and part of that tax helps to pay for the roads. Now, these people who are driving electric cars, they ain't buying petrol. How dare they? So I guess we're going to have to make up for it by charging them a tax for every kilometre, a few cents for every kilometre they drive. This has made some people very unhappy, has it not?
Yeah, look, it's not popular in the EV community. It's not popular internationally, really. It's I think, what you could call a somewhat inevitable law. I don't have a huge problem with this idea of roads cost money to maintain, and the users of the roads should contribute towards the cost of maintaining that, although there's obviously also a larger economic benefit to having roads that exist. But the issue is that Australia lags behind the rest of the world in a painful way in terms of EV adoption. It's something like 0.7% of all new cars sold in Australia are EVs, whereas I think Norway currently leads the world.
Yeah.
It's something like 75% of the cars there are EVs. And the environmental benefits of EVs, I'm not going to spend hours lecturing people on this, but they're fairly hard to argue against. So there's
unless you own an oil rig or a coal mine or something like that, and then I'm sure you could find reasons to hate it.
Well, look, we could get someone
or
political on this.
Funded your campaigns.
Yeah, we could get someone political on this, and obviously within Victoria it is. But a lot of places are offering incentives, and here in Australia, basically it's only the ACT that has really solid on-the-ground incentives in place right now to pick up EVs, but they are expensive. Look, I'm in the process, I've written about this a little bit on my own blog, of buying an EV, but I'm buying a second-hand imported EV because there's just nothing in that affordable space in Australia. Saying to EV drivers, right, by the way, it's going to cost you a couple of hundred or potentially a couple of thousand, does depend on how far and how long you drive. It's going to cost you that much more is painful. And it's even painful for the people who have those hybrid vehicles, the ones that are joint electric and petrol, because whilst I think they only pay 2 cents a kilometre versus 2.5 for the EVs, that's going to hurt if most of your driving's on petrol, because then you're being double dipped.
I was going to say, can they tell which driving was done under what? That's very shifty.
It's messy, and it's been really clear from the experience of places like Norway. The reason their adoption is so high is because they worked really hard on giving people good incentives, saying, right, you won't have to pay road tax, you won't have to do these things. Over time, you can expect to evolve that, but it just feels very retrograde to say before we've even started that we are sticking in that world. So
they do stuff in Norway, like I think you don't pay rego, or your rego's half, and you get free rides on ferries and through tollways and all kinds of stuff that Norway does to encourage them, where we pretty much do everything we can to discourage it.
Yeah.
And it's kind of fascinating because if you look at public sentiment, there's a huge groundswell of interest. There's a lot of people. I mean, when I started writing about this, when I made the decision to pick up my own car, I wrote a piece for my own blog, and I got a huge quantity of interest in that. And I got lots of people kind of commenting and querying and asking questions. But you look at surveys and so on, there's a big groundswell of people who are interested but need the vehicles, which we don't entirely have, need the infrastructure, which again we don't entirely have. This just acts as another brake on that progress. And it's one we sort of don't need. I mean, Adam, you mentioned kind of if you owned a coal mine. There's a great little YouTube channel which a guy who owns a Tesla has set up. Coal miners driving Teslas. I encourage people to look it up. I will point out there is some strong language involved, but it's basically you get these big burly coal mining blokes, exactly the kind of guys who would love a V12 Ute. You put them behind the wheel of a high performance Tesla, and you watch them lose their minds because those things have insane acceleration. They love it to bits, and we're a country that could benefit a lot from EVs in all sorts of ways, but we're just stepping back at a time where we should be putting our front foot forward.
And part of the problem is because of our policies, it affects the kind of cars they sell in Australia. I'm assuming that you're not looking to drop 70, 80, whatever it is to cost a Tesla.
I am on a tech journalist salary.
Yes, exactly.
So,
a little bit out of your budget. It would be a bit out of my budget as well. Now, if we lived in another country like Norway, there'd be a nice spread of cheaper and mid-range electric vehicles as well. But we don't get that here, do we?
No, look, I mean, the cheapest new EV here is just north of 40 grand.
Yeah.
And they all tend to punch up above the kind of luxury vehicle tax level, frankly, which is fine if you want a luxury vehicle. I mean, Teslas are lovely, lovely, nice cars. There's a bloke down the road who has one. He won't let me take it for a drive, partially because I don't know him. But anyway, they're really, really nice cars if you're a car person. But that everyday car thing is not particularly well catered for. There's not a big groundswell.
Why
of
is it not catered for here? Why don't the manufacturers send?
Partially because there's been less incentive to do it at a government level. There has been this ongoing dialogue around range and range anxiety, and I get that for some people, although I've crunched the numbers, they don't add up for a lot of people. They don't add up for me. I mean, I'm buying a second-hand Japanese Nissan Leaf. Not a huge range on that thing. But it doesn't matter because the car it's replacing does maybe its longest journey is about a third of the effective range of that car. At which point I'm back home again and golden.
Only driven by a little old lady Akihabara on Sundays.
Not so much that. It's just that's a lower range car.
Yeah.
But the argument you hit all the time is, but I need it to be able to do 500k, and I don't want to stop.
What if I want to drive
12
to Broome?
hours and things like that, which ignores fast charges. It does take into consideration the fact that we don't have anywhere near enough charges. There's this weird thing right now where I figure EV owners probably have it okay, not good, but okay in the sense that if you come across an EV charger, the odds of there being another EV car there are quite low because, hey, we just haven't sold many. Yeah. As soon as that starts to pick up, you're going to have queues like you have at a petrol station, but worse because your charge time might be 15 minutes, 20 minutes, something like that. That's a problem that does need to be solved. But there are so many people who buy cars and do short city hops with them 99% of the time, if not 100%, where any EV would be fine. they're easier to sell overseas, so we just don't see them here, which I think is a huge, huge pity. And unfortunately, we are just taking it really slowly because there hasn't been that kind of political boot up the bum to say to politicians, right, you need to make things happen here.
I mean, there's been the reverse. I mean, it was only the last federal election where there was literally the anti-EV campaign along the lines of, they're coming to steal your weekend.
Yeah.
And that line has kind of been quietly retired. It seems like there's a bit of a recognition that's moving. There's little tiny other things happening. There's experimentation now for Australia about for your long-range trucks, which might be a problem with the exchangeable battery. The idea that, okay, if you're trying to do trucking, we'll just say, right, we'll take one battery out, another one in. You don't have to worry about the charging time. And so I think when we start to see those solutions, it'll get there. But yes, it's frustrating and yet not surprising because Australia hasn't been good at any of these things that are involved in making the world greener. So why would we assume we're any better at this one?
Hopefully businesses will actually help drive this, because it'll be when, I don't know, your Telstra or some big, your Cisco's, whatever, decide to replace their fleet of cars. If they decide to buy a few thousand electric vehicles and replace their entire fleet, well, then that improves the economics for everybody else. So maybe that private money will help change the economics and then bring the prices down for everybody else. And you'll see more on the road, and people will be thinking, oh, yeah, I could get into that.
Well, we're already seeing that, actually.
Yeah.
Because you get, here in New South Wales, the NRMA, and I think it's the RACV in Victoria,
in Melbourne,
have set up fast chargers in prominent highway locations. Now, they're paid services. You pay for the power. It's not that Tesla thing where if you were in early enough, you got free charging.
Yeah.
But they're the equivalent of the petrol station. And having done a bit of research around this recently as I wait to get my new car, there are some petrol stations that are starting to think, hey, maybe if we had a single EV charger, we might do okay on this. Because the other practical reality here is, and we've kind of circled around it before, we're going to start getting worse and worse cars because they're going to be produced less and less.
And they're going to be dumped
get
here.
old designs, inefficient designs. We've already got pretty awful, dirty petrol in Australia as it is. And we are going to hit an inflection point where actually it's going to be really awkward and difficult for all sorts of people. And getting back to what we're talking about with Computex, it's going to get even worse because the other thing that an EV is full of, in fact, any new car, EV or petrol, is full of is chips. And there's fewer of those around as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So that creates the problem. So suddenly you end up, you become a third world country in terms of the cars that you've got available. And that looks like the scenario for Australia. And it's just ugly.
Yeah. Hertz and Avis will start renting out horse and cart. Get to the airport and say, oh, yeah, I'll need two of them, and throw in some hay.
Sorry, the last sulky just got out.
Yeah.
We've got this penny farthing, but it's not waterproof.
So speaking of ancient technology, he says in the most beautiful segue, I think, ever on the show. Smooth. Super smooth. The NBN, what's the latest?
It's broken.
It's broken. And that's all we have time for this week.
Are shocked.
Yeah.
Gus, how broken is it?
It's broken in an interesting new way, I think we could say.
That's good for us.
Time,
it gives us something to talk about.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the time when we're criticising the NBN, it's because of the poor technology choices or the idiotic wholesale model. To sort of start with some of the obvious ingredients in the soup du jour. But what's actually going on this time is there's a problem with NBN's own deployment technology for people trying to make appointments so they can actually get the NBN installed. And the practical result is that thousands of people just can't get installation because none of the RSPs can actually book in appointments to make new connections. And this is totally down to NBN, getting software deployment wrong. And like businesses get software deployment wrong all the time and NBN gets stuff wrong all the time. So maybe that part of it's not surprising, but we really haven't run into a thing before where the problem was, we're actually just having trouble working out how to get you that appointment, as opposed to saying, well, maybe the appointment won't be for 3 weeks. Maybe the guy won't show up on the day and then it'll take you 3 weeks to rebook it. But it feels to me in the very long history of NBN screw-ups, I still think this is the first version of this that I can remember.
And how long's it been going on for?
So it's effectively early part of this year, but it's been mounting up. They started trying this new system for getting people to install stuff. They started out in smaller states, which is kind of seems okay, but then they scaled up too quickly. And when they hit New South Wales and Victoria, which has happened in the past month, it has really, really blown out. So now we've hit the point where I think there's like something in the order of 11,000 orders that haven't been processed yet. And, that's quite a lot of people, who are not getting an NBN service. And, you can imagine if you were hanging around the state, perhaps where there's a lockdown, you think, I really really need a better service in my house here. This is just going to be particularly not pleasing news.
But these are the people who have already been waiting for a long time because our good friend Paul Fletcher tells us the NBN's done, right?
Well, not some of them, not all of them. So alongside those 11,000 odd new connections, there's something in the region of 8,000, 8,500 service requests. And these are presumably people who have a service, but there is an underlying problem and the ISP has determined, right, it's not our back end, it's pits and pipes and cables and connectors. It's the stuff that NBN Co is responsible for the maintenance of. Those also aren't being seen at.
Oof.
And while that's a different kind of frustration, when you've got those kinds of numbers floating around, it's genuinely problematic. And it's problematic, especially, I think, for a network which is trying to still continue to sell itself as the future of Australian broadband, which I'll lay my cards on the table here. I think it should be. I think a physical network is still very much a necessity for a country as big as this. But it's trying to do that against 5G. It's trying to do that against the kind of public sentiment that's somewhat turned to the, NBN's really kind of painful to deal with. Making it more painful is not helping.
Yeah. And don't forget, we've also still got all those people waiting to get HFC because that got switched back on and then got switched back off again. So now no one knows when they're going to get hold of those things. So it's bad news. One of my favourite details out of this is obviously the NBN's worked really hard on saying, we built this network, but you've always got to go and talk to your RSP. So at the moment, all the service providers are copying all the annoyed phone calls saying, why can't I get an appointment? Why won't this guy show up? And NBN has said if there are TIO fines involved with people not meeting service, they'll pay those. They're really acknowledging that, we have actually messed this one up.
Yeah.
This is our fault. That's a bit of a rarity because I don't think we describe the NBN as particularly contrite as a company, not so
Not
into
often.
acknowledging
Not
those
often.
things. So I'm enjoying that little detail, but it's a reminder again that they're not necessarily set up to deliver things in a way that's going to maximize benefit for everybody. And they failed software deployment, and lots of business fail that, but. No.
But the retailers cannot take the moral high ground here. There's a few things going on, but I'll just jump in with a little story of my own. Something happened recently. You got contacted by a reader who said, I was on 140 plan, so 100 down, 40 up. And my retailer said to me, why don't you try our gigabit plan? We'll put it on we'll give you a free upgrade for a while and see how it goes. And they went, oh, yeah, all right. So they did. And it was no better. I don't know what kind of technology they're on, but clearly their connection wouldn't do any better than 100. So they went, all right, put me back. So they put him back on 120. And the guy's like, that ain't right. I was on 140. I was on 140. And they're like, oh, sorry, NBN doesn't offer 140 anymore, which of course is not true. It's that the retailers, understandably because of the pricing models, started to say, right, well, sometimes we'll offer 140, sometimes we'll offer 120. But it's still possible to give someone 140.
Yeah.
These people just weren't going to do it. So this guy spent 3 weeks arguing with them and they went, no. So he sent me an email and I sent them an email and said, this guy was on 140. I think maybe you should give him 140 back. I think the ACCC might be very interested in the fact that you're selling one thing and then giving it back because he'd had this for years. He'd had it long enough that they couldn't take it away from him. He got it back the next day.
Oh, that's nice. And it's been quite a good week for the ACCC because another example proving that, yes, there's no moral high ground for the providers.
Yes.
We had 2 of the bigger providers, Dodo and iPrimus, were fined because they'd been misleading consumers about what their peak evening speeds were because rather than saying typical ones, they basically picked the best possible speed you could get and said that would be what was in there. So they ended up, they got fined. And I mean, it's often felt, I think, when we've observed these things that we haven't seen enough going on to actually make companies honest in that respect. So it's always pleasing to me when if they do things like that are dodgy, they get called out for it and they actually get fined because that's the most powerful incentive not to do it because we know that the margins are thin on the NBN. And if you have to start paying, large fines, ain't no profit coming out of that.
So I suppose, the NBN is our super du jour. We keep coming back to this. But is there a fix? Is there a thing that could be done or a structural change that could be made to make the NBN a more palatable entity at government, business and consumer levels?
Do we have enough silicon to build a flux capacitor? Because I can fix it for you then.
I hear there's a shortage, so it could be a problem. Look, I think it would be possible to do it better. I do think you could devise it, because if you devise in a sense of saying, like, we just want to make this a genuine utility and not necessarily this has to be a massive for-profit thing, then some of these problems would be solved. But there is zero political will to do any, and this is the problem. There's no desire to change this fundamental model. There's no one saying, hey, we have a different model we're trying to pursue here. So I think, yes, you could, if you didn't have the ridiculous wholesale structure, some things would be better, but I don't know that it would happen. And also, I don't know, bad software deployments are a fact of life. They've kept me employed for a quarter of a century writing about them. Like, the fact is, software is hard. It is hard to get things right at scale. And in that way, the fact that they can't do an ordering system, even when it's based on sort of pre-built components, is not that surprising. I think the attitude to how you deal with it is possibly where we'd like to see a shift. But I don't think anyone's getting in there like hypnotizing the NBN board and saying, hey, do you want to approach this in a totally different way? So maybe we could look into that. Hypnosis is the future.
Well, that just about wraps up another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Gus for making time for the show this week.
A pleasure, as always.
Now, you've been a guest on the show many times, so I'm sure you know this is coming. The classic Vertical Hold 3 questions. Where can people find your work online? Where can they find your social media online? And, of course, the big contentious question, which science fiction TV show is the all-time greatest? Think carefully.
So people can find my work online at finder.com.au. They can find me on Twitter, GusWorldAU. I've been following this question closely for many, many weeks, and it's really offensive that it had to be asked, and really offensive that nobody so far has actually given the correct answer, the only possible correct answer, which is, of course, Doctor Who.
Of course it is. Finally, somebody has got it 100% right. We've had kind of 80, 85% Babylon 5 style answers, but finally it's right. I can retire that question. We'll have a new question next week, folks, because that is the answer I've been waiting for.
Who all the way.
Absolutely. And while you bask in the glory of that answer, you can also catch us online at Vertical Hold AU on Twitter, verticalhold.com.au on the web, or via the Vertical Hold Facebook page.
And thanks again for dropping by. And just a reminder for regular listeners, we're thrilled to have Aussie Broadband as our sponsor this year. And they've given us a special promo code which gives new customers a $10 per month discount for 6 months when signing up online for an unlimited plan between NBN 50 and NBN 100. The promo code is vertical. So hopefully that'll come in handy for Australian listeners shopping around for a great broadband service. And as always, thanks for listening. Hang in there, Melbourne. Don't forget to tell your friends about the podcast. Leave us a review on your podcasting platform of choice and help us spread the good word. Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support. All right.
Beautiful work on all those conditions there too.
I've got it all written down. Because I screwed it up one time, and I can't remember who the other guest was. It was Alex, and someone said, dude, you got that wrong. You just made a promise they're not going to want to deliver. Okay, maybe I better read that again.